The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Karen, you can go ahead now.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Karen Rokish, and we are very excited to see such a great turnout this morning and so much interest in accelerating revenue growth. I think we're ready to begin our webinar. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we start. We've muted everybody's phone. We've got a pretty short webinar this morning, and we have a lot of material to cover, but we do want to make this interactive. So if you have any questions, please type them into the chat box so that we can see those, and we'll answer as many of those as possible at the end of the call. Also, we'll give you contact information for us at the end of the webinar. So if you're interested and you want a copy of this presentation or one of our executive briefings, feel free to email us. Finally, I'd like to introduce you to our presenters today, Carter Hinckley and Corey Torrance. Both Carter and Corey are managing directors at Blue Ridge Partners. They both have deep experience in the software and services industry. Both of them have worked in sales roles, management roles, and consulting roles. They've both worked at software companies, and they've also worked for major consulting firms. Carter's experience comes from Booz Allen, and Corey's experience comes from McKinsey & Company. Corey, I think you're going to kick us off.
Yes, thank you, Karen. Good morning, everyone. Carter, Karen, and I want to thank you all for taking time out of your morning to join us. Today is the second in a series of 6 webinars that we're hosting that are solely focused on top-line growth. Why focus on growth? Well, as you can see from this chart, over a 10-year span for the US S&P 500, revenue growth was by far the single biggest driver of total shareholder return. Hence, it's a pretty important topic these days to have growth as a priority. As you can see, cost reduction, which came in second and is often a more visible exercise, had less than half the impact of revenue growth on shareholder return. This is not to say that other actions aren't important, because they clearly are, but to really move the needle, companies need to grow their top line. At Blue Ridge, we only focus on revenue growth. That's the sole focus of our practice, and we begin all of our client engagements by understanding our clients' revenue equation. Basically, how do they make money every day? As the 5 components on the revenue equation on this slide illustrate, how and how well do they attract, retain, and grow their customer base? We've found that the revenue equation to be an effective and easy-to-use tool to ask the right questions and discuss the right issues with our client teams. It gives us a framework to steer the dialogue in the right direction and also make sure that we get everybody on the same page. We look at how the sales team brings on new logos, which is usually the hardest aspect of growth, how they onboard and service their customers, are they easy to work with, and how do they handle the hiccup or two along the way. And how do they grow revenue from these customers over time? Each of these critical activities need to be carefully evaluated and tweaked periodically to keep the revenue engine running smoothly. All 5 of the levers listed on this chart are components of the revenue equation, and each can have a significant impact on growth. But today, our focus will only be on number 2, the importance and impact of customer retention. Basically, practical ways we have seen that can stem customer attrition. Now, Carter's going to give us an overview of the steps we're going to cover today to help you keep your existing customers. Carter?
Thanks, Corey. So focusing on the second point in the revenue equation that Corey was just going over, this diagram summarizes 5 steps, 5 things that you can do to prevent attrition and to retain customers. It all starts with a fact-based analysis of attrition right there in the top left. Based on that analysis, you need to develop a set of strategic options to respond to the attrition. And that's where most companies stop. But the companies that are really successful at preventing attrition go further, and they actually develop an early warning notification system with pre-established responses when they see an indication that a client might leave, especially a valued client. And finally, the really effective firms continue to monitor attrition on an ongoing basis. So what we're going to do here this morning is spend a few minutes on each of these. First, and critically important, firms that minimize attrition develop a fact base using the process such as the one that we've outlined here. Interestingly, the first step, which is often skipped actually, is to define what your firm means when you say attrition. Is it anyone who hasn't bought from you for a month or a quarter or a year? And what's it based on? Is it based on order volume or sales dollars? It's going to be different for different companies, of course, but it's important to make sure that everyone in the company agrees on that definition. Once you have the definition clear, you can then analyze meaningful metrics about the attrition. How many companies have you lost, for example, or is attrition growing? In which segments or products or geographies? You need to break it down. Because if you look in the aggregate, you may miss what's really happening. Now, once you have the metrics in hand, you have the data, and you can analyze the root cause of attrition. Has the market changed? Has your product or service changed? What do customers value, and why do they buy or not buy from you? You need to get this information straight from the customer, though, by the way. And interestingly, your salespeople may be the worst sources of the information, since customers who leave them are likely to give them a sugar-coated reason for their departure. In the red circle, we have a caveat. That is that you need to distinguish good attrition from bad attrition. So for example, if you lose an unprofitable customer or a customer that's very needy, that actually might be the best thing that could happen. So you only want to prevent attrition with your good customers. And finally, firms that are great at preventing attrition take the time to do one more thing. They assess the cost of attrition, not just the lost revenue, but the cost of trying to rescue that business, and then the cost of replacing the business. So once we've got these 5 steps, Corey, what do we do next?
Well, once you have a clear understanding of what customer attrition is and developed a fact base, as Carter described, and why it happens, we see top-performing companies, the ones that rarely lose customers, or at least the customers they want to keep, proactively develop strategies to prevent attrition even before it occurs. Some potential strategies we've seen used are listed on this chart. Maybe you need to change your pricing structure, or at least revisit it on a periodic basis, or maybe benchmark yourself against your competitors' pricing, or perhaps adjust your payment terms. In some segments of the software and services industry, we've seen accommodations to customers' requests for modified payment terms turn into a real win-win for both parties. Or you can offer different levels of customer service. This is a common exercise by customer segment based on the value the customer places on scope and timeliness of customer care. Not all customers want or value a lot of hand-holding, which can be very costly. So in this case, maybe a tiered approach to customer service is warranted. Whatever. The point here is that you need to continue to listen to your customers and identify innovative ways to incent them to stay with you and become loyal advocates. That's the real goal. And then, once you have a set of options or responses to negative triggers that hit your radar screen, you need to prioritize them and select the best for a given situation. There are a number of ways to prioritize actions for different issues. For instance, in the examples shown here, it might be a lot easier to adjust payment terms than overhauling your go-to-market model. In fact, I'm pretty sure it is. The chart on this slide illustrates a simple 2x2 matrix that we've used that allows you to prioritize different strategies by the impact they would have versus the difficulty in implementing them. You can see in the bottom right, the gray box, that you have the degree of implementation challenge very high, but the potential long-term value is very low. Those clearly should be dropping to the bottom of your list. They're very hard to implement. It's going to take up a lot of resources. They're not things that should be focused on because they're not going to be delivering a lot of value. Whereas if you look at the blue box, those are things that are relatively easy to implement but are going to deliver significant long-term value. The ones in the orange box might be things that you need to plan for over a longer period of time because they have a high return, but they also may carry significant risk with them. Okay, with our actions defined and prioritized, let's see what the important signals to look out for are. So now we know what attrition is, why it happens, what we're going to do about it. How do you anticipate issues and take preemptive action? Keeping your hand on the pulse of your customer relationships. That's critical. You don't want to do that on a periodic basis. You really need to know what your customers are thinking and how they're being served. There are obvious ways to see when attrition is happening, like when a customer walks out the door. That is a relatively easy sign that things aren't going so well. But there are sometimes subtle early warning indicators that are critically important and oftentimes overlooked. This chart lists some examples of early warning indicators that we've seen used effectively. What's interesting to me is that in isolation, each may not be a red flag, but taken together, it should cause concern and swift action. For example, a reduced NPS, or a Net Promoter Score, in conjunction with a request for a proposal from an existing customer should be a red flag that is acted on pretty quickly. One thing we've seen work well is a sort of consolidated trigger dashboard, pulling together the key early warning signals in one place, data that probably already exists somewhere in the organization. In order to give you the big picture, this can be a valuable tool, particularly to the head of sales, but also to all members of the executive team. It's also a way to get everyone on board and focusing on and participating in retaining your best customers. It should be on everyone's priority list. Okay, so Carter, what's the plan to deal with these?
Actually, that's the key. You need to have a plan to deal with the early warnings rather than just responding to them in an ad hoc, kind of unplanned way. The firms that are really good at keeping customers over the long term have a set of prescribed responses to these attrition alerts. It's kind of like their SWAT team responses. And these are tailored responses that are, and this is the key, that are broken out by customer segment, product, and or geography. By contrast, if everything is handled in a one-off situation, preventing attrition can be expensive and pretty exhausting, actually. In addition, alerts may fall between the cracks, or worst of all, the customer might get conflicting responses from different parts of the organization. We worked with a client, for example, where the salesperson, with all good intentions, responded to a customer who threatened to leave with a price decrease, while the customer service rep responded with a contradictory action that ended up confusing the customer and actually made matters worse rather than better. One last point on this, we're often asked how to implement and promulgate prescribed responses across the team so everyone understands who's supposed to do what and when they're supposed to do it. And we found that the best way to do this is to use what we call a playbook. Other people may call it something else, but many companies already have a sales playbook in place, or they should if they don't. And that's the ideal place to put the defined actions and responsibilities for each of these alerts. In addition to giving everyone instant access to what they should do, if a playbook is online, it can easily be changed and updated as needed. So there's one last step that we've seen in the most effective companies, those companies that make customer retention part of their DNA, and that's to monitor retention on an ongoing basis. They actually refresh the fact base repeatedly. They review their strategic opportunities and their strategic options routinely. They update their prescribed responses when it's needed, and they make sure that the organization is actually executing these responses as planned when these alerts occur. The result is impressive. Once institutionalized on an ongoing basis, we've seen over and over again that customer retention can have a dramatic impact on firm value, enabling you to grow revenue without having it diluted by customer attrition. So in conclusion, retaining customers on the surface may seem pretty straightforward, but we hope we've shown you that the firms who are really good at preventing customer attrition have mastered the subtleties of the customer retention process. And these 5 steps, which we've reviewed today, are the keys to their success, and we hope you'll be able to take advantage of them to prevent attrition in your firm as you grow revenue. In future revenues, we'll cover other strategies to grow revenue. Our next topic will be how to increase your share of each customer's spend in a particular product category. But first, Karen, back to you. Do we have any questions?
Yes, we do actually. And just a reminder for everyone, if you do have a question, please type it into the chat box and we'll answer as many of these as we can. The first question that someone typed into the chat box was, you mentioned reasons for attrition might include changes to your product or service, but what about changes at our customers? Aren't they also sometimes the problem? Carter, can you answer that one?
Yes, that's actually a good point. There are many reasons a customer can leave due to changes in their organization rather than yours. We focused a little bit more on your own organization, but in your customer's organization, they might have a new executive who replaces someone who was formerly your champion, or maybe a new purchasing procedure. I've even seen a situation where we had a terrible financial crisis. The key in all of these is to look for these changes early and actually to make them part of your early warning system. If your team is in close touch with your customers, somehow these should come up as an alert for you to take action. I can think of one example. If you have back to that champion, if you have a champion in one of your customers who starts grumbling and saying they might leave, you should take that as an alert and have a response, which might be something like, we need to build out the number of relationships in our organization. We need to expand our network. So when that person leaves, we have lots of other relationships in place.
Thanks, Carter. What about, how have you seen firms respond to customer retention issues? Is it always a monetary response like dropping price?
Karen, I'll take that one. We've found that most of the time that's not the answer. A monetary response is often viewed as the fastest and easiest quick fix, but it's not the best answer. Many times we've seen the client really needs attention, a little care and feeding, not a reduced price. For example, we work with a company whose customer felt ignored and poorly served after their account rep was replaced. Reducing the price of services wasn't the answer. A bear hug strategy was actually what was needed.
Okay, just a reminder, if people have questions, please do type them into the chat box. One other question that we have is, This sounds expensive. It sounds like a pretty complicated process to analyze attrition, track alerts, spend time responding. How do you justify the cost of all of this? And Carter, is that one that you can answer?
Yeah, actually, I've seen that question. I've gotten that question a lot. You know, I think that one of the things we've seen is that companies are already spending more time and more money than they realize responding to either actual customer attrition or threatened customer attrition. And in fact, because they're doing it in a one-off basis and they resolve a problem over and over again, they're probably spending more money than they would if they had a prescribed response. The other thing is that the cost of customer acquisition, the cost of replacing lost customers, is significantly higher than the cost of customer retention program, keeping your good customers. So actually the question I guess I would ask in response to this is, can you afford not to have a customer retention plan?
Okay. One question we got was someone asking if they will get these slides. And yes, when we're finished with the question and answer, we will pop up contact information for both Carter and Corey, and feel free to email us and we will send you a copy of the slides. The next question was, can you discuss what makes an effective trigger dashboard?
The trigger dashboard, as we discussed, it's a number of metrics that are probably tracked in silos. It might be within the sales organization. That might be part of a regular cadence of sales management meetings. It might be financial triggers, like accounts receivable all of a sudden becomes rather large with a particular customer. That might be within the finance organization. It might be an increased number of calls to the customer service center. There's a whole array of data points that typically are tracked, but they're not tracked in one place. But by aggregating them and putting them against the financials of a particular account or customer, and then looking at them as a total relationship dashboard, it becomes pretty clear when certain one or more of these triggers start going in the wrong direction.
Okay, and then we have one more question. In your experience, where does the responsibility for the analysis and tracking usually live within the organization?
Well, what I've seen, it really varies by firm, by industry sector, and by the organizational structure. But it's often owned by the head of sales and supported by the CFO. But really, others on the management team all benefit from being able to see where attrition might occur. And it's obviously very important that the team is working in a very coordinated way, as Carter had mentioned earlier.
Okay, those are all the questions that came in. Maybe we'll just give it another minute and see if anybody else has a question. Okay, well, I think that is all of the questions. We'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. Again, we've got the contact information up on the screen for both Carter and Corey, so please feel free to email either one of them if you want a copy of today's presentation. We do have a number of executive briefings that have been written on customer retention, and you can email us if you'd like to get any of those. And also if you'd like to get on the invite list for our next webinar. As Carter mentioned, that this is the second in a series of 6, and so next month or in the next 6 weeks or so we'll be having our next webinar. So if you'd like to be invited to that, just let us know. Thank you all for joining us, and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.